Under the moonlight, Mu Chun gazed at the young girl whose obsidian eyes shimmered with a light as if they could speak, locking onto him. His face stiffened involuntarily, clearly caught off guard by the sudden turn of events. Though the girl before him was undeniably captivating, and accompanying her would be something many would dream of, Mu Chun could sense a mysterious aura surrounding both of them, making him hesitant to get too involved. Before Mu Chun could speak, Gulin quickly interjected. No. If their father and mother found out that Gulin had allowed Kai Xiao to go to the so-called Dragon Phoenix heaven alone, and with a stranger no less, they'd probably strip him of his skin. Mu Chun breathed a sigh of relief when he heard Gulin's objection. Nodding, he spoke honestly. Sorry, we're not that familiar. Taking you along. Not only would you be uneasy, but I wouldn't feel at ease either. Gulin, hearing this, gave Mu Chun a look that seemed to say, you know what's good for you. But Mu Chun chose to ignore it. Kai Xiao curled her long legs, resting her sharp chin on her knee. Her enchanting eyes glanced faintly at both Gulin and Mu Chun before she said, your opposition is pointless. I've made up my mind. Even if you won't take me, I'll find someone else to guide me. With so many people heading to Dragon Phoenix Heaven, finding someone to lead the way won't be a problem. Mu Chun shrugged indifferently. As long as it wasn't with him, she could find anyone she wanted. However, Gulin's face turned a shade of green. His expression was one of despair as he mournfully said, Sis, you're going to get us all killed. His voice sounded so pitiful that even Mu Chun couldn't help but chuckle. This guy, despite his terrifying power, seemed to be completely dominated by the girl before them. Kai Xiao smiled, her voice light. Now you have two choices. Either let him take me, or I'll find someone else myself. Gulin's delicate face twitched, clearly knowing his sister's temperament well. Once she decided on something, no amount of persuasion would change her mind. I'll go first, Mu Chun said with a forced chuckle, sensing the fire was about to turn back on him. He started to turn, but just as he moved, a hand fell on his shoulder. Turning his head, Mu Chun looked at Gulin, who gazed at him with eyes nearly brimming with tears. Through gritted teeth, Gulin said, Big brother, for the sake of the 5 drops of ancient flame dragon essence blood I gave you, don't let me down. Mu Chun's words were completely sincere. The girl before him was as beautiful as Luo Li, her allure undeniable. Yet, the difference in their aura was striking, one cold and distant, the other seductive and mysterious. Typically, a girl of this caliber would be surrounded by danger, and traveling with her could only spell trouble. Choose the lesser evil. Gulin clapped Mu Chun on the shoulder, his expression grim. Mu Chun rolled his eyes. You actually trust me? Gulin was willing to trust a stranger to escort a delicate beauty like Kai Xiao, but Mu Chun couldn't fathom what was going through his mind. Moreover, based on Kai Xiao's spiritual fluctuations, she seemed far weaker than Gulin. Don't worry. No one in this world can take advantage of my sister. Gulin smiled, a mysterious glint in his eyes. If you underestimate her, you'll regret it. Mu Chun was taken aback and couldn't help but glance at Kai Xiao again. Come on, just help us out this time. We may not have known each other long, but compared to others, I think you're someone we can trust. Gulin smiled. Anyone who can stay calm after we extorted 5 drops of ancient flame dragon essence blood from him, and still sit down to chat with us. That person is certainly no ordinary individual. Of course, the most important thing is, Gulin gestured toward Kai Xiao, my sister has sharp senses. Since she doesn't mind you, there's no reason for us to worry. Mu Chun smirked, clearly unconvinced by this last point. Do I even have a choice? Mu Chun rubbed his brow in resignation. Kai Xiao smiled sweetly. If you don't, I'll have to trap you here until Dragon Phoenix Heaven ends. I agree. Mu Chun nodded decisively, his tone clear and firm. He knew better than to doubt the seriousness of Kai Xiao's words. Given the strength of both her and Gulin, he had no doubt they could easily follow through. Smart, Kai Xiao smiled lightly. Every movement she made exuded an enchanting charm, one that made Mu Chun's gaze linger, though he thankfully managed to keep his composure. Don't worry, Kai Xiao continued with a smile. Traveling with us won't harm you. While my power is somewhat restricted due to my physique, I won't be a burden. Besides, as you said, the young elites from the northern domain are all heading to Dragon Phoenix Heaven. They're no pushovers, and you might find that you need my help." At this point, she lightly tapped her jade-like hand, her eyes sparkling mischievously. "Considering all this, guiding me would benefit you more than it would hurt, so you have no reason to refuse." Mu Chen was left speechless, while Gu Lin, watching the exchange, patted Mu Chen's shoulder sympathetically. "See? I told you, you can't win against my sister. Just accept it." Mu Chen shot him an exasperated look. "Rest for the night, and we'll leave tomorrow," Gu Lin said hastily, clearly worried that Kai Xiao would simply leave with Mu Chen right away. This time, Kai Xiao nodded lightly, gracefully leaping up to a large tree, her slender figure vanishing amidst the dense leaves. Seeing this, Gu Lin finally shifted his gaze to Mu Chen and cupped his hands, saying, "Mu Chen, I'll be troubling you this time. I'll remember this favor, and if I ever need anything, feel free to ask." Mu Chen shrugged and replied, "The situation is stronger than me. If I kept rejecting you, it would be a bit inconsiderate. Generally, if it were someone else with strength like Gu Lin's, Mu Chen probably wouldn't have had much say in the matter. With such power, it was hard to refuse. Yet, Gu Lin and his sister didn't abuse their power, which actually made Mu Chen feel a bit more favorable toward them. Even if you truly refused, we wouldn't do anything to you. Otherwise, if my mother finds out, it might be a little uncomfortable," Gu Lin chuckled. Mu Chen laughed, feeling a surge of goodwill. The two chatted happily by the bonfire. Meanwhile, high in the tree, the young woman gently leaned against the trunk. She listened to their laughter below, her enchanting eyes softly closing, a slight curve forming on her lips. Mu Chen, huh?" she murmured softly. The next morning, in the forested mountains, Mu Chen gazed at the elegant Kai Xiao standing beside him and sighed helplessly. He turned to look at Gu Lin, who shrugged in resignation. Clearly, both of them were at a loss when it came to dealing with her. "Mu Chen, I'm leaving my sister in your care. If you encounter any trouble, feel free to take action. Whatever the consequences, I'll take responsibility," Gu Lin said, cupping his hands and giving a smile. Gu Lin was dressed in black robes, his appearance handsome and refined. His manner of speaking carried a certain grace. The brother and sister clearly hailed from an extraordinary background. Mu Chen smiled and nodded. "It's about time. I'll be on my way now. If you finish your task, you can wait for her outside Dragon Phoenix Heaven. Farewell." Mu Chen cupped his hands, then glanced at Kai Xiao before turning and walking off. Gu Lin watched Mu Chen's retreating figure before turning to Kai Xiao, his face filled with concern. "Sis, you have to be careful. If father and mother find out, I'll be scolded again. Don't worry. Help me keep this a secret, and you'll get your reward," Kai Xiao said with a teasing smile, waving her small hand. "I'll be off now." She was carefree, casually waving her hand, and before Gu Lin could say anything more, she transformed into a streak of light and soared through the sky, chasing after Mu Chen's distant figure. Gu Lin sighed helplessly as he watched them disappear. "Young master, are you really going to let the young lady go with him alone?" A distorted shadow appeared behind Gu Lin, its figure hard to make out, and a hoarse, elderly voice rang out. Gu Lin nodded, scratching his head in frustration. Though true dragon essence blood was valuable and rare, his sister had seen countless treasures since childhood. It shouldn't be the true dragon essence blood that was drawing her in. So why was she suddenly planning to head to Dragon Phoenix Heaven? Don't worry. Although her power is sealed, no one in the Northern Domain's younger generation can harm her. As for other powerful beings, if they're foolish enough to try something, it'll be their misfortune. She carries our father's soul mark. Let's go. We need to leave as well. Gu Lin waved his hand, and the space in front of him distorted. His figure suddenly vanished, and the shadow disappeared with him. The mountain forest fell silent again. Meanwhile, Mu Chen raced through the sky at full speed. Within minutes, he had exited the mountain range. He glanced over and saw Kai Xiao walking toward him, hands behind her back, moving with graceful steps. As expected, she hadn't been left behind. Mu Chen pursed his lips and slowed down a little. "You don't really think you can shake me off like this, do you?" Kai Xiao said, walking beside him, her head tilted slightly, her smile playful. Mu Chen awkwardly scratched his nose and said, "Can we negotiate something?" "Go ahead," she replied. "Could you wear a veil?" "Smiling at random people like that could cause some trouble," The young girl shot him a glance with her bright, enchanting eyes, completely ignoring Mu Chen's suggestion. Her jade-like, fair feet moved lightly, and with a soft step, she sped off towards the distance. Only the crisp and pleasant sound of her footsteps lingered in the air. No way. Dragon Phoenix Mountain Range. This ancient region, ever since the Northern Domain came into existence, has been one of the most famous ancient lands within the Northern Domain. Particularly after the discovery of Dragon Phoenix Heaven, this vast land became one of the most bustling and popular places in the Northern Domain. Right now, it was the time when Dragon Phoenix Heaven was about to open again. As a result, the area was experiencing an unprecedented surge of activity. The wind tearing through the sky never stopped, and countless figures swept across the sky like locusts, heading towards the Dragon Phoenix Mountain Range. Dragon Phoenix Heaven had a reputation in the Northern Domain that was simply too resounding. Almost every young powerhouse, from all corners, would seize this chance to make a name for themselves. But most importantly, the attraction of Dragon Phoenix Heaven itself was irresistible. When Mu Chen and Kai Xiao arrived at the Dragon Phoenix Mountain Range, they witnessed a spectacle akin to locusts sweeping through the area. The sheer number of people was astonishing, leaving Mu Chen a little dumbfounded. These people were not ordinary individuals. They came from various factions, and within their own powers, they were the elite of the younger generation. However, upon arriving here, even the brightest stars seemed to be overshadowed by the overwhelming flow of people. Mu Chen was deeply amazed. He had seen his fair share of outstanding young talents in the northern Song continent, but in terms of both numbers and quality, they were nowhere near comparable to the Northern Domain. After all, this place was where the true elite of the vast world gathered. At this moment, Mu Chen finally understood the true scale of the Northern Domain. Even the great Luo Heaven Domain was just a small corner of it. Moreover, the Northern Domain was just one part of Tianluo continent. This Tianluo continent truly lived up to its name as a supercontinent. Let's head to the Dragon Phoenix Ancient City. It's the closest place to the opening of Dragon Phoenix Heaven, Mu Chen said, pointing towards the depths of the Dragon Phoenix mountain range. In the far distance, the outline of a grand and awe-inspiring city could be seen faintly. Kai Xiao curiously looked around, then casually nodded. Mu Chen took the lead and swept forward. After about 10 minutes, he slowed down, his gaze trembling slightly as he looked ahead. There, towering mountains seemed to be forcibly pressed together by an overwhelming force. On top of these massive peaks, giant handprints could vaguely be seen. Above these peaks stood an ancient city so vast it seemed to have no end. The city was covered in the marks of time, and an ancient, primal aura permeated the air, enveloping the entire area in a sense of desolation. At the city's edge, there were stone towers standing tens of thousands of feet high. From these towers, faint spiritual energy fluctuations could be felt. Mu Chen recognized the signature of these fluctuations. They were the signature of spirit arrays. In ancient times, this place must have housed an incredibly powerful and world-shattering spirit array. But with the passage of time, that once mighty array had been worn down by the ages. The city was so magnificent it was awe-inspiring. Even as light and shadows continuously flashed across the sky, like locusts descending upon the ancient city, there was no sign of congestion within the city. Mu Chen and Kai Xiao entered the city, landing on a bustling, ancient bluestone street. As soon as they appeared, numerous heated gazes were cast upon them. Of course, all those gazes were focused entirely on Kai Xiao, who stood beside Mu Chen. Kai Xiao, seemingly accustomed to this kind of attention, naturally ignored it. Mu Chen, however, couldn't help but feel helpless, as those gazes, once they had seen Kai Xiao, inevitably shifted to him. Yet, the hostility in their eyes was hard to mask. Trouble, Mu Chen sighed. Kai Xiao shot him a glance, and the enchanting charm in her expression made Mu Chen's heart skip a beat. The same effect was evident in the stunned gazes of those around them. However, despite the attention that Kai Xiao attracted by walking beside him, it seemed that with her around, gathering information was incredibly easy. All she had to do was smile sweetly and casually ask someone, and the person would become dazed and reveal all the information they knew. Let's go. Let's check out the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion. Mu Chen watched yet another unlucky soul who had been mesmerized by Kai Xiao's beauty before turning his gaze to the southern part of the city. According to the information Kai Xiao had gathered earlier, there was indeed a Dragon Phoenix Pavilion within the Dragon Phoenix ancient city. All the latest and most complete information regarding the Dragon Phoenix heaven came from there. The two of them walked through the bustling ancient city, eventually stopping in the northern part. They looked up, and in front of them stood a golden-yellow pavilion, standing quietly. This pavilion had a unique design, with dragons and phoenixes intertwined. There was a faint aura of true dragon might and phoenix spirit emanating from it. At this moment, many figures in the city were flying toward this place. Through his senses, Mu Chen could tell that those who were heading this way were generally stronger than those in other parts of the ancient city. Clearly, only the elites of the younger generation from the northern domain were qualified to come here. Those who felt their strength was lacking naturally wouldn't dare enter easily, for fear of humiliating themselves and damaging their reputation. However, Mu Chen wasn't deterred by this. He focused on the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion and walked directly inside. Upon entering, his vision instantly broadened, and the noisy sounds of the crowd surged into his ears. Looking around, Mu Chen saw that the pavilion was divided into several levels, each bustling with people. Every person was surrounded by powerful fluctuations of spiritual energy, and on the higher floors, an immense spiritual pressure spread out, making the air seem heavy with power. As Mu Chen and Kai Xiao entered the pavilion, the noisy sounds gradually became more distinct, and countless amazed gazes turned toward Kai Xiao. Mu Chen remained calm. He found a corner with Kai Xiao and sat down. According to the information they had received earlier, it seemed that there were people in the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion who specifically released information about Dragon Phoenix Heaven, and they just had to wait here. Mu Chen had originally hoped for a quiet gathering of information, but with Kai Xiao, who acted like a beacon, he knew he had already become the object of attention for many young elites in the pavilion. Someone was likely already starting to inquire about his identity. And sure enough, as Mu Chen expected, a familiar gaze immediately fell on him from a higher level when he entered the pavilion. The gaze was filled with a coldness. Lu Yin was sitting high above, his eyes calmly focused on Mu Chen's direction, and then his gaze swept over to Kai Xiao. Lu Yin was surrounded by many figures. Clearly, this was a rather large circle, and those present were all well-known figures in the northern domain's younger generation, each with a notable reputation. However, within this group, it was clear that the focus was on two individuals. One was Lu Yin, but he wasn't the most important one. To his right, a slender figure was smiling brightly, drawing countless heated gazes from the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion. This beautiful figure wore a long, fire-red dress. Her skin was as white as snow, and under the dress, her delicate body outlined a full and alluring curve that made the blood rush. She had a face of extraordinary beauty, with eyebrows like crescent moons. Her pair of mesmerizing phoenix eyes were filled with an enchanting allure, and when her eyes flickered, they left people feeling flustered. Around her, countless young elites, though dressed impeccably, had flames burning deep within their eyes, as if they were eager to devour her. This enchanting woman had an overwhelming sense of possessiveness that no one could resist. What a beautiful little sister. The woman in the red dress also noticed the exceptionally stunning Kai Xiao, then glanced at the unfamiliar Mu Chen beside her. She covered her lips with a delicate hand and smiled, saying, "But this young man is quite unfamiliar. Did a new young talent from the northern domain emerge that I don't know about? He's the new leader who recently emerged from the great Luo Heaven domain," Lu Yin said with a faint smile. "Seems he has some skill, since Lu Ming was defeated by him." Upon hearing Lu Yan's words, the young elites from the northern domain, who were well known in the younger generation, immediately understood the relationship between the two. Several young powerhouses with a close friendship to Lu Yin chuckled, their eyes mischievously fixed on Mu Chen, who was sitting below. "So it's someone from the great Luo Heaven domain." The woman in the red dress seemed to realize something, then looked at Mu Chen with a smile in her eyes. "Looks like the great Luo Heaven domain has produced quite an impressive newcomer this time." The great Luo Heaven domain may be a top force in the northern domain, but their training of the younger generation has always been unimpressive. For these years, Dragon Phoenix Heaven hasn't really had much to do with them. Why are they suddenly showing interest now? Didn't they lose enough face before? A young powerhouse, who was friendly with Lu Yen, said with a mocking tone, his words full of aggression. His voice wasn't hidden but deliberately carried by a thin layer of spiritual power, which made it echo down from the higher levels. Instantly, the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion fell into a brief silence, with countless eyes turning toward the young figure in the corner below. That figure paused for a moment, but did not explode in anger. His handsome face remained calm. Lu Yen casually played with his teacup, not even glancing at Mu Chen. He simply let out a faint smile and subtly nodded toward the young powerhouse who had just spoken. Upon receiving his gesture, the young powerhouse grinned, stepped forward with a flick of his toes, and shot out like a tower, landing in front of Mu Chen. He reached out and grabbed Mu Chen's shoulder. "Brother Lu Yen wants you to come up and join him. Kid, follow me." His hand landed on Mu Chen's shoulder, but the latter remained motionless, as solid as a rock. Mu Chen's figure didn't budge, yet a cold voice, carrying a hint of frost, rang out through the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion. "If you want to make a move, do it yourself. Don't send these lowly ones. Are you not afraid of tarnishing your title as the young hall master of Shantian Palace?" As Mu Chen's somewhat chilling words echoed, the previously noisy pavilion fell silent for a brief moment, followed by many amused glances. Some eyes subtly shifted toward the figure at the higher levels. Lu Yan's reputation in the younger generation of the Northern Domain was undeniable. His high rank of 4th on the Dragon Phoenix record was proof of his status. Although everyone gathered in the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion could be considered elite members of the Northern Domain's younger generation, they couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation when facing Lu Yan. He was one of the most powerful competitors in Dragon Phoenix Heaven, someone no one dared to underestimate. So when they saw someone daring to challenge Lu Yan directly, their expressions grew intrigued. On the upper levels, Lu Yan remained calm as he heard the words. His expression didn't change much, and he merely smiled lightly with an air of superiority. Clearly, his status here far surpassed that of Mu Chen, an unknown person. If he casually responded to Mu Chen, it would lower his own stature. Some young powerhouses who were friendly with Lu Yan let out low, disdainful laughs, their unfriendly gazes turning toward the young figure below. The red-dressed woman, who was the center of attention in the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, also let out a faint, amused laugh. As countless eyes in the pavilion focused on that direction, the young powerhouse who had previously attempted to grab Mu Chen's shoulder now wore a grim expression. He clearly hadn't expected that someone with only the strength of a third-grade supreme would disregard him so easily. However, he was somewhat composed and didn't directly lose his temper. Instead, he took a step back, cupped his hands in a polite salute, and smiled faintly. "I am Lu Yang from Snow Dragon Mountain. Might I know your name, friend?" Snow Dragon Mountain was also a significant power in the Northern Domain, comparable to the 100 Battles Domain. Lu Yang was one of Snow Dragon Mountain's top talents, his strength likely rivaling that of Qin Bei from 100 Battles Domain. Although Lu Yang was weaker than Lu Yan, he still had some renown in the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, and many people had heard of him. Mu Chen, with his back to Lu Yang, looked somewhat cold, his handsome face carrying a faint chill. He hadn't expected to run into Lu Yan here, and he certainly hadn't expected Lu Yan to be so impatient. However, this guy seemed to have some arrogance left in him. He didn't deem it necessary to directly strike at Mu Chen, likely thinking that the latter wasn't worthy of his attention. So, under his subtle cue, his little gang of lackeys couldn't help but jump out. Kai Xiao sat beside Mu Chen, her small hand resting on her fragrant cheek as she watched the scene unfold. Then, she turned to Mu Chen and gave him a slight smile. "Seems like your ability to stir up trouble is just as strong as mine. They're already slapping you in the face." Mu Chen's expression remained calm and unruffled. He didn't turn around to look at the arrogant LV Yang from Snow Dragon Mountain. After all, the Great Luo Heaven Domain was one of the top forces in the Northern Domain. If this were any other time, Snow Dragon Mountain wouldn't dare to make a sound, but now, they were audaciously acting in front of him. If he responded directly, it would undermine the status of the Great Luo Heaven Domain. LV Yin might be proud, but he had no idea that the arrogance in the heart of this young, gentle-looking man was far greater than his own. After LV Yang announced his name, he received no response from Mu Chen. His eyes twitched involuntarily, and a murderous gleam flickered in his gaze. When did a third Great Supreme dare to act so arrogantly in front of him? Did he truly think this was still the Great Luo Heaven Domain? Looks like this friend thinks Snow Dragon Mountain isn't enough of a threat. Haha. Well, considering the strength of the Great Luo Heaven Domain, I suppose you could argue that we have the qualification to challenge it. LV Yang chuckled, a mocking glint flashing in his eyes. But, do you really think you've earned that qualification too? Boom. As the last word left his mouth, LV Yang's gaze suddenly grew cold. A vast spiritual power erupted from his body like a storm. The overwhelming strength made many strong figures within the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion glance over in surprise. LV Yang's power was likely nearing the level of a fourth grade supreme. While not the absolute top of the younger generation, he was undoubtedly in the first tier. Boom! With an icy expression, LV Yang stamped his foot. His figure shot forward like a ghost, and his immense spiritual power gathered in his palm, sending a ruthless strike toward Mu Chen without hesitation. He planned to use his real strength to make this young man from the Great Luo Heaven Domain understand that in this place, his so-called dignity could not be preserved. Here, no one cared where you came from. If your strength wasn't enough, you'd be thrown out of the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion. Snow Dragon Palm. With a low shout, cold air like a frozen river surged from LV Yang's palm. A gigantic snow dragon charged forward, enveloping Mu Chen's area in a blizzard. Within the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, the gazes of many watching figures slightly sharpened. LV Yang was indeed ruthless. His first move was a deadly strike. The Snow Dragon Palm, charged with the chilling energy of Snow Dragon Mountain, would freeze the spiritual power within anyone struck. Even if they expelled it, their meridians would suffer damage. And in this kind of situation, being wounded in the meridians meant that this young man from the Great Luo Heaven Domain could forget about continuing in the Dragon Phoenix Heaven. The snowflakes came rushing toward him from behind, but Mu Chen's figure remained still, unmoving. However, Kai Xiao, sitting opposite him, suddenly stiffened. She saw Mu Chen's dark eyes turning an astonishingly deep black, and for a moment, his face became indifferent, losing all the liveliness that had been there before. Moreover, if before, there had been a subtle surge in Mu Chen's spiritual power, now, his spiritual energy had grown extremely restrained. This wasn't because his spiritual power had weakened, but because his control over it had reached an almost perfect level. Mu Chen raised the teacup in front of him with his long fingers and took a gentle sip. Meanwhile, the terrifying cold air from behind had already arrived, even causing snowflakes to appear in his hair. Countless powerful figures within the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion watched in astonishment. Didn't he realize that the deadly attack was almost upon him? But Mu Chen's spiritual energy fluctuations showed that he had no intention of defending. What is this guy trying to do? Is he looking for death? Someone muttered in confusion. This strange scene didn't just provoke a flurry of whispered questions. Even figures in the higher levels, hiding in the shadows, couldn't help but let out a soft gasp of surprise. The offensive was approaching like a roaring thunder. A cold, sinister arc appeared at the corner of Lu Yang's mouth. At this distance, even if Mu Chen tried his best to defend, it would likely be too late. Who would have thought that the young expert sent from the Great Luo Heaven Domain this time would be such an idiot? It seems that once again, the Great Luo Heaven Domain will be left with a massive joke. Boom. However, just as Lu Yang's sinister grin appeared, the space in front of him suddenly distorted, and then a thunderous sound, so strange and overwhelming that it seemed to shake the very soul, pierced through all his defenses in the most bizarre way. It exploded from deep within his mind in an instant. The thunderous sound was so sudden and strange that Lu Yang had no time to prepare. His spiritual energy immediately lost control, surging wildly, and his consciousness began to blur. A mouthful of fresh blood spurted from Lu Yang's mouth without warning, and the Snow Dragon Palm imprint shattered, turning into a storm of snowflakes. Blood could be seen flowing from his 7 orifices. The snowstorm swept behind him. It was only then that Mu Chen turned around. His figure, like a ghost, appeared before Lu Yang in an instant, and his palm lightly pressed against his chest. Bang! A torrent of spiritual energy erupted, and Liu Yang's body was sent flying. Blood sprayed from him as he left a long trail through the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, and finally, with a loud crash, he shattered a window and flew out of the pavilion. In that instant, the entire Dragon Phoenix Pavilion fell silent. Many gazes, filled with shock, turned to the slender figure. What had just happened was so bizarre. It seemed like Mu Chun had done nothing, yet Liu Yang's offensive had shattered on its own, and he was left bleeding from his 7 orifices. What exactly did he do? Many powerful figures stared in disbelief. Soon, their expressions grew serious. To have defeated Liu Yang so swiftly in just 1 round, even among those in the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, few could have achieved this. This young expert from the great Luo Heaven domain was not to be trifled with. Some exchanged glances, and when they looked at the figure again, there was a hint of wariness in their eyes. In the upper levels, it was equally quiet. Liu Yan's eyes darkened, while the woman in the red dress's gaze flickered with a faint gleam before she began to thoughtfully observe Mu Chun. Several more powerful figures from even higher levels also shot down looks of surprise. Interesting. A voice seemed to comment from the shadows. Within the stillness of the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, Mu Chen's previously darkened and deepened eyes slowly returned to normal. Then, he raised his head, his cold gaze locking onto Liu Yan, and his voice rang out. "Can you take action yourself now?" Liu Yan's teacup silently cracked into countless tiny pieces, then shattered completely, turning to dust. With an emotionless expression, he clapped his hands and slowly stood up. As he stood, the atmosphere in the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion immediately became oppressive. The fierce man ranked 4th on the Dragon Phoenix record was truly going to take action himself? On the high levels of the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, Liu Yan's figure stood up. Though not imposing in stature, his presence immediately made the entire pavilion's atmosphere grow heavy. An invisible sense of pressure spread throughout the room. It was the weight of Liu Yan's aura. As one of the fiercest figures ranked 4th on the Dragon Phoenix record, Liu Yan's reputation among the younger generation of the Northern Domain clearly far surpassed Mu Chen's. In the eyes of many, the two were not even in the same league. Though Mu Chun had defeated Liu Yang with his lightning techniques earlier, no one would consider him truly capable of standing against Liu Yan. Liu Yan stood high above, looking down with indifferent eyes. A chilling coldness gathered in his gaze, and the pressure radiated, all of it now pressing down on Mu Chun. The air around Mu Chun seemed to freeze. A spiritual energy pressure from the heavens descended, attempting to crush his body. With Liu Yan's strength, even a normal 3rd grade supreme would likely have been forced into a miserable state by this spiritual pressure, but clearly, Mu Chun was not one of them. His body glowed with flashes of lightning, and from within, the faint rumble of thunder could be heard. The overwhelming spiritual pressure that descended like a mountain had no effect on him whatsoever. Their gazes met in midair. The coldness in the air seemed to drop the temperature within the pavilion. "Looks like you've made some progress since last time. No wonder you're so bold." Liu Yan's voice was cold, with a hint of murderous intent. Then, his eyes suddenly grew sharp. His 2 fingers curved, and he pointed downward in the air. Boom. At the moment when Liu Yan's 2 fingers pointed in the air, the space seemed to ripple with visible waves, and then a deep red color suddenly spread, resembling a blooming flame. Flame Demon Finger. As Liu Yan's cold voice echoed, within the sweeping red light, a thick, crimson giant finger materialized, burning with fierce flames. The high temperature caused the entire Dragon Phoenix Pavilion to become hot and dry. Boom. As the crimson giant finger took shape, it pierced through the void, heading straight for Mu Chun to suppress him. The powerful individuals near Mu Chun immediately retreated, fearing they would be caught in Liu Yan's fierce attack. The only one remaining unaffected was Kai Xiao, who smiled as she watched the confrontation, showing no intent to intervene. Her clear, beautiful eyes glowed with keen interest. Boom. Mu Chun raised his head, staring at the incoming fire giant finger. His black eyes remained calm. Then, he clenched both hands. 2 distinct forces of spiritual energy rose from his palms. Roar. The sound of a dragon's roar and an elephant's trumpet rang out simultaneously. 2 rainbow lights shot out violently from Mu Chen's palms, transforming above his head into the forms of a dragon and an elephant, which then intertwined and merged into a shining disc, roaring forward to collide head-on with the fire giant finger. Boom! The loud crash echoed as the violent spiritual energy fluctuations swept through, shaking the space. The dragon elephant disc emitted dazzling light, and it shattered along with the fire giant finger. The spiritual energy fluctuations rushed toward the two combatants, but were casually dissolved by both of them. As the spiritual energy in the air dissipated, Lu Yan's gaze grew sharper. Although his initial attack had been a casual one, it was powerful enough to suppress any third-grade supreme. Yet, Mu Chun had easily neutralized it. This result clearly displeased Lu Yan. Everyone could feel the cold, murderous aura emanating from Lu Yan and the increasingly overwhelming spiritual energy fluctuations. Their expressions immediately shifted. Meanwhile, the beautiful woman in the red dress glanced at the scene. She chose to remain a bystander. Her relationship with Lu Yan was not particularly close. Though the young man named Mu Chun appeared to be merely a third-grade supreme, she was cautious and would not underestimate him. She knew that some waters were too deep to tread carelessly. Mu Chun looked up at Lu Yan. His eyes glinted coldly. Although fighting here wasn't the wisest choice, if Lu Yan truly meant to fight, Mu Chun wouldn't mind showing him that this soft persimmon he thought he could squeeze might not be as easy as he imagined. If you don't want to be thrown out of the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, you better leave now, Lu Yan said condescendingly, pointing toward the pavilion's grand door. Mu Chun smiled and replied, "Then I'll have to trouble young Hall Master Lu Yan to take action. You're courting death." Lu Yan's eyes finally turned icy. He moved, and terrifying spiritual energy surged like a storm from his body. His figure, carrying the overwhelming force, shot toward Mu Chun in a straight line. He was truly making his move. Mu Chun's eyes narrowed. The space behind him rippled as the Supreme Sea subtly emerged. Majestic spiritual energy rose with a roar. Two completely different energies quickly gathered in his palms. From within the Supreme Sea, the sounds of dragon roars and elephant trumpets could be heard. Mu Chun's body suddenly crackled with lightning, and he stomped his foot hard, instantly launching himself toward Lu Yan for a direct collision. In the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, countless strong individuals were shocked by the scene. Could it be that the Dragon Phoenix heaven wasn't even open yet, and they were about to witness a top-tier battle? Under the watchful eyes of countless gazes in the pavilion, the two figures streaked past each other. However, just as they were about to clash, a gentle voice suddenly rang out through the pavilion. "Please, two of you. The Dragon Phoenix Pavilion is not suitable for a battle. I ask that you both refrain." When the soft voice echoed, a beam of white light descended from the sky, exactly at the point where Mu Chun and Lu Yan were about to meet. The soft light expanded, momentarily halting their figures. Though this power wouldn't truly stop them, when the voice spoke, Lu Yan's eyes clearly flickered, and his body paused before he actually retreated with a violent rush, back to the higher levels. Mu Chun also slowly descended, his spiritual energy dissipating as his gaze turned to the upper left. There, standing like an exquisite lotus, was an incredibly beautiful woman. She wore a white gown, her features were stunning, and she was not in the least inferior to the woman in red. On her fair forehead, there was a faint red mark, making her seem almost saintly. When she appeared, Mu Chun could feel the entire Dragon Phoenix Pavilion stir with waves of excitement. Many gazes were filled with deep admiration. "Please, both of you. The information for this Dragon Phoenix heaven will be announced shortly. I hope you will pause your fight." The woman in the white gown smiled at them and spoke gently. "Heh, so it's Fairy Su Bua." Lu Yan smiled gracefully, his face softening. He nodded and said, "Since the fairy has spoken, I will let him go this time." Down below, Mu Chun lightly chuckled. Upon hearing his laughter, Lu Yan's gaze turned cold, but he ultimately refrained from taking further action. However, his killing intent toward Mu Chun clearly grew stronger. Mu Chun didn't pay much attention to Lu Yan. He understood that Lu Yan was merely looking for an excuse to step down. The Dragon Phoenix Pavilion harbored many powerful figures, and even Mu Chun could sense the danger in some of the auras. Lu Yan must have sensed it too. If Lu Yan were to engage in a battle here with Mu Chun, regardless of the outcome, they would both suffer consequences. And at that point, someone might take advantage of the situation. After all, everyone knew that once they entered the Dragon Phoenix Heaven, they would be competitors, particularly for someone like Lu Yan, who was highly competitive. If given the chance, everyone would want to eliminate him first. What surprised Mu Chun, however, was the woman in the white gown. She was none other than the holy maiden Su Biyue from 10,000 Saints Mountain, ranked third in the Dragon Phoenix record. No wonder she possessed such astonishing power. Sister Su, you've ruined such a good show. How disappointing. A playful voice suddenly rang out. The woman in the red dress smiled at Su Biyue, her arched brows filled with flirtatious charm, causing people to feel a lump in their throats. Good shows will come in the Dragon Phoenix Heaven, and at that time, little red fish will surely enjoy them, Su Biyue replied with a calm smile. That's true, but this time, you'd better be careful, sister. Using small tricks like last time won't win, Red Fish said with a playful grin. Let's hope so, Su Biyue nodded. The two beauties' conversation brought a sudden calm to the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion. Everyone could hear the underlying tension between them. Though they weren't surprised, after all, many knew about the rivalry between Su Biyue and Red Fish in the Northern Domain. This made the crowd even more excited. A catfight between two beauties was certainly more intriguing than the standoff between Mu Chun and Lu Yan. Mu Chun, however, wasn't interested in their rivalry. Noticing that Lu Yan had given up on fighting, he decided to sit back down. This friend from the great Luo Heaven Domain. If you're interested, might I invite you upstairs for a chat? Just as Mu Chun was about to retreat, Su Biyue's beautiful eyes suddenly shifted toward him, and she gave a light smile. It seemed she had taken a slight interest in him. Little handsome, how about you come sit with me? Whoosh. Within the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion, countless gazes instantly turned toward Mu Chun, their jealousy impossible to conceal. Mu Chun was momentarily stunned, and then he couldn't help but twitch his mouth. Why drag him into this fight between two vixens? This could easily turn him into a public enemy. At times like this, no matter whose side he took, he would clearly offend someone. Mu Chun would rather offend someone like Lu Yan, but he was extremely unwilling to cross women who were not only powerful and cunning, but also stunningly beautiful. Their level of threat was far greater than someone like Lu Yan. However, just as Mu Chun was starting to feel a headache over this, Kai Xiao, who had been leisurely watching from the side, smiled faintly. That fleeting smile, like a flash of a blooming flower, instantly made the eyes of countless people in the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion shine brighter. Even those as remarkable as Su Biyue and Hong Yu, two breathtaking beauties, were momentarily dazzled by the enchanting face of the young girl. Their beautiful eyes flickered with a glimmer. Then, the girl's clear voice, as crisp as pearls falling onto a silver plate, rang out within the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion.